told you last time that we would spend the first session talking about a sort of overarching issue of the election. The second time looking at a more granular statistical look at what some of the issues, the areas, the potential swing populations are in this election, which we're actually only going to do for half of this session because there's something else that after debating back and forth, I really decided I want to talk about in the second half. And next Thursday, for our final session, we will do a after-action report, a post-mortem, looking at how things actually went down relative to what we might have thought, what we might have expected, what pundits might have expected. So for those of you who get a hard copy of the New York Times still delivered to your house, if you're like me, so on Tuesday, what showed up in your Times was a special election supplement that included this map. So as soon as I saw it, I said, oh goody, it's 4 newsprint pages wide. It's gigantic. I told my children not to touch it or get any greasy fingerprints on it, and I hustled it over to the academy to get it laminated. So this is my new favorite toy, using it in my AP government classes. This is it. We couldn't quite figure out how to hang it up here, so Josh was kind enough to find it for us and put it up on the screen. It's not quite as big, but I think for our purposes, it will do. Now it's very important before we use this map, it's important to tell you about what many people who specialize in the visual display of information would see as a major shortcoming of this map. And so I want to make that clear before we start using this map. This is a map that shows geography. It shows counties, not population. So that, for example, New York State here looks like a lot of pale red and yellow with a little blue dot right down there where New York City is. But as you all know, when it comes to election outcomes, New York City is blue. It's Democratic. New York State, is blue. It's Democratic. How does that happen? Because there are enough votes in New York City that combined with the rest of the Democratic votes in what's otherwise a kind of pale red and yellow upstate, you end up with a Democratic state. So I just want you all understand what I'm saying when I say the map shows geography, not population. And when population is very concentrated in a few, I'm going to show you one more example of this, and then I'll lay out what this map is about and look at some more things. Look at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania also looks red, right? Pennsylvania hasn't gone red in a presidential election for quite a long time. So why does Pennsylvania look red? Pennsylvania looks red because most of what you're looking at, if you've ever driven, I went to college in Cleveland. We can now offer our condolences to the people of Cleveland. Now return to our regularly scheduled programming. I'll just tell you the last 2 times the Indians were in the World Series, I was in college in Cleveland. That was 95 and 97. And in 97, they lost in a 7th game, extra innings, that I was watching with my friends from college, and they were like all hysterical and devastated. And I wasn't so much because in 96, the year in between, the Yankees went to the World Series, won it, and then would proceed to go back and win again in 98, and again, that was the start of a few good years for the Yankees. But my friends in Cleveland were very sad then, and they are presumably very sad this morning. So, driving to Cleveland, that's where this story started, you drive straight across the state of Pennsylvania on I-80, and you know you're driving through the mountains in a lot of barely populated, very rural areas that happen to vote red. But on this side of the state in blue, you have Philadelphia, and on this side of the state in blue, you have Pittsburgh, and between the two of them, really primarily Philadelphia, they have enough blue votes, enough Democratic votes, that the state of Pennsylvania has been blue, I believe it's since the 1988 presidential election. Okay?
I think with the Times bias, they wouldn't have done it this way.
So it's an interesting choice. You can find online maps that distort the geography of the states to actually match the people, if you understand what I'm saying. They stretch and bend and fold the map so it more accurately represents the population. And in that sense, it may be a more accurate map. I find those maps dizzying to look at. You look at a map of the United States where, if we can zoom back out, thank you, where this whole area, which is very depopulated, is compressed, and then this area is stretched out. I can't look at that. My brain can't process it that way because I'm used to looking at a map of the US that looks like the map of the US. So I'm going to use this map, and I told my students we're using this map in class, understanding that caveat. But if students ask, as they often do, how can it be, again, this is a map, so let me just back up and clarify. This is a map, county by county, of the United States, reflecting the election returns from the 2012 presidential election. The more overwhelmingly the county went for Mitt Romney, the darker red it is. So lighter red is, Romney, but less so. Really dark red is really Romney, and the same with blue. Okay, darker blue is more Obama, lighter blue is Obama, but less so. Anything that was between 55% Obama and 55% Romney, so somewhere swinging in the middle, is yellow. That's what yellow is. Okay, yellow is sort of up for grabs. So if you look at this map and it's like really a lot of red, you're like, well, how did Obama win the 2012 election? And the answer is because in the United States, people vote, acres don't vote. Here you have these really big, really empty states. This is the great state of Wyoming. Wyoming has fewer people in it than Brooklyn does, right? So it's a very big state. It takes up a lot of room on the map. It's very red. You go looking for Brooklyn, it's one of those blue dots in New York. Brooklyn has a few times as many people as Wyoming does. Wyoming has a few 100,000 people. Brooklyn has 2+ million people. So understand, again, since in our country we let people vote and not acres, this map, although accurate in a certain sense, doesn't accurately represent what's going on electorally. Although this does help us see some very important things, and its accuracy that's sort of inaccurate, it does help us see some very important things that I'd like to point out now. And again, after about doing maybe a half an hour of this, we'll move on to what I wasn't planning to do now, but think we have to. So the first thing, I'm going to say one more thing before we go on. Okay, because this is interesting. This is just a useless factoid that's really interesting. It used to be that every election they would flip off, the broadcasters would switch off using red for Democrats or red for Republicans, blue for Democrats or blue for Republicans. That used to be a thing. In 1996, red mapped Democrats and blue mapped Republicans. After 2000, we got stuck permanently with red meaning Republican and blue meaning Democrat. How did that happen? Here is how it happened. Because in 2000, the election was not over on election night. If you remember that whole thing, it went on for about another month. And so instead of looking at the map for one night and then we move on and we come back 4 years later, so flip the colors, who cares? We had just spent a month living with blue as Democrat and red as Republican, and it kind of got stuck in people's heads. And they thought at that point, if they switched the colors back, we'd all get confused. So it's the 2000 election and its aftermath that results in permanently fixing red as Republican and blue as Democrat. Until then, the television newscasters switched off every 4 years just
So
because
what's
they
the
switched
year
off.
origin for red state?
It's post that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like I wonder how soon that would,
That red state, blue state comes
Yeah.
post that. Okay. Oh, I remembered in 2000, I remembered that 1996, the Democrats were red. But then 2000 fixed it. Okay, so looking at our map, remembering that red is Republican, blue is Democrat, and yellow is somewhere in the middle, what do we see about Democrats in the United States from this map?
And then either end.
Okay, either end, and what else do we see?
Concentrated.
Very concentrated. Remember that Democrats, that blue voters, won this election. They won this election, but they are concentrated. They are concentrated in urban areas, big concentrations in the Northeast and the West Coast, okay? The border counties in Texas, right? The border counties in Texas. And so we see that Democrats are much less geographically dispersed than Republicans are. This actually fits with something that we know from our study of the past few decades of demography, which is that people in general have been sorting where they live by their politics. Now that doesn't happen because politics is the thing they sort for, it just comes along. No one says, oh, I want to live with other Democrats, so I will go move to where there are Democrats, but very often Democrats want to be in cities. And so Democrats pick themselves up and move to big cities. And so what's left in many of these states, both in the Midwest and the Mountain West, you see a lot of red because their kids are then younger, more likely to vote Democratic. They're moving to New York, they're moving to LA, they're moving to Chicago. Even within red states, it's a little bit hard to see here, but for example, within Texas, the blue you're seeing is Houston, it's Austin, it's Dallas. Those are the little patches of blue you're seeing in the big red that is Texas, okay? And so Democratic voters tend to be attracted to cities, tend to cluster in cities, and that's how you can see such seemingly tiny points of blue on such a big red map, and yet the blue carried this election. Where that makes a very big problem for Democrats, where does that geographic clustering make big problems for Democrats? Presidential election doesn't matter. Where does it matter? Yes?
Electoral college.
Well, but in the Electoral College, they've done okay, because remember, a few blue dots in Pennsylvania can actually carry the whole state. It makes a big problem for the House and the Senate. The fact that you can have whole states and House districts as well. So, for example, I actually live in what I believe is it might be the second most Democratic. I was going to say the most Democratic, but I actually think it might be the second most Democratic congressional district in the United States. My congressional district, which is currently Charles Rangel's district in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, although Charles Rangel is now retiring after 40 some odd years and somebody will replace him, is D plus 42. That means the Democrats generally do 42 points higher than the Republicans in my district. Okay, D plus 42 is what my congressional district is. But that means they're all voting for one congressman, right? So some of those votes are, so to speak, wasted. Yes? You all understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
If 30% of the district votes for the Republican and 70% votes for the Democrat wins in a huge, but then there are other voters who aren't in other races who aren't voting, and the Democrats' concentration can hurt them in House races and in Senate races as well. There are whole states here where they're having 2 senators, both Republicans, even though that state has 800,000 people or 1 million people, and then we have loads and loads of Democrats crammed into California, which has many more million people, but still only has 2 senators. So somebody wrote a piece in last Sunday's Times or the Sunday before that said, "Go Midwest, young liberal." Like, if you really want to help the Democratic cause, you have to spread out. This concentrating, which people want, they're looking for. I want to live in an urban community with people like me, with nightlife and activity and recycling and composting bins and hipsters in Brooklyn who hand make wooden gadgets, and it's all grand. But if everybody's moving to Brooklyn to be a hipster hand making wooden gadgets, then we're depopulating states in the Midwest, the Mountain West, where there might once have been a Democratic vote, a Democratic senator, where there isn't so much anymore. Okay? So that's one thing we see. I want to point something out here because I think it's really awesome. You see this band of blue across the middle of the Deep South? What's that band of blue across the middle of the Deep South? What's that band of blue across the middle of the Deep South?
African American.
African American population. Why are there so many African Americans across the Deep South?
Slavery.
Because that is where their ancestors were brought as slaves and remained there. Why was there so much slavery in this swath of the South? Because that's where they were growing cotton. Why were they growing cotton there? Because the soil was particularly rich and fertile. Because hundreds of millions of years ago, this is actually true, hundreds of millions of years ago, that soil was underwater. It had deposition of organic matter in it. It's very, from dying sea creatures and whatever, and it's very rich soil now. And so it became the place they grew the cotton, and so it was the place that African American slaves were brought, and so it's the place that African Americans lived, and so the footprint of hundreds of millions of years of geological history and economic history and racial history we see on a voting map today. Now here's something else that's interesting. That strip across the South, I told this to my students today, they gasped, don't gasp. That strip across the South was known as the Black Belt. It was not called the Black Belt because African Americans lived there. It was called the Black Belt because of the black richness of the soil. I noticed that on this map in the Parshanut that the New York Times gave on the side, they called it the Cotton Belt. I think the sensitivity of how we talk today, people were uncomfortable referring to it as the Black Belt, even though that was not meant to be a reference to the race of the people who lived there. It was a reference to the color and the richness of the soil.
Not politically correct.
But the New York Times has taken to calling that the Cotton Belt. Okay, let's point out a couple of other things here that are interesting. I'm just going to go back to Pennsylvania for a minute. There's a political expression about Pennsylvania that I have seen attributed to, and I've looked, but I've only looked online, which doesn't count as real looking because there's lots of stuff online that's not true. So I can't swear to you that he's the one who said it, but it's been attributed to James Carville, who was a political aide to President Bill Clinton and was part of the team, along with George Stephanopoulos, that helped get President Bill Clinton elected. And James Carville is famous for having said about Pennsylvania that it's Philadelphia on the east, Pittsburgh on the west, and Alabama in the middle. That was his line about Pennsylvania. So again, it's important to see as we break this down in a more granular way, county by county, we think of Pennsylvania as a reliably blue state, and it is, but it's a reliably blue state because of concentrated Democratic voting in 2 cities, primarily Philadelphia, and a big middle of the state that's very different than that. So I think that's also, it's interesting as we look at it at a more broken down level. New York State is similar. We just stop right there while we're here. And that New York State is also a very blue state. And yet if you look at New York State broken down, what you have is intensely blue New York and kind of pale red to yellow swingy upstate counties. Now yellow is anywhere from 55% Obama to 55% Romney, so those might still have gone blue, but they're not very blue. And then you have quite a bit of pinkish reddish up there, right? But the intense blueness of New York City and the immediate surrounding areas, coupled with whatever blue you have upstate, carries the day. And so again, I think looking at this broken down in a more detailed way helps us understand something. And I will remind you, connecting back to what we said last time, that it may well be those voters, right, those white voters without a college education in the middle of Pennsylvania, in upstate New York, who are becoming Trump voters who are part of the Trump phenomenon. And particularly if you live in a state like that, that's going to go blue every 4 years, even if that's not what you want or not what you're voting for, that may only exacerbate your sense of not having your voice heard. Okay, we go back to the
Maybe they should
full
move to
map.
Alabama.
Right.
In reality.
It's an interesting conversation that I didn't put on the table for us to talk about, but the question about electoral college and getting rid of the electoral college and what impact that would have on voting is an interesting and complicated one to think about. Because right now, basically, it sounds oversimplified, but it's almost not. It's like North Carolina and Pennsylvania is the whole shooting match in this election.
What about gerrymandering?
So I'll get back to gerrymandering in 1 minute. Florida's important, Ohio's important, but North Carolina and Pennsylvania is really the whole shooting match in this election. Where if we didn't have an electoral college, every voter in every state would matter equally much. Whether that would be a good thing for the process or a bad thing for the process is hard to play out and parse out, and there's a lot to talk about there, but I didn't put it on our agenda, maybe some other time. But certainly would help every voter in every state feel like their vote mattered in a way that a Republican voter in New York State doesn't really feel like their vote matters all that much right now. I'll just address gerrymandering before I take your question. Gerrymandering, well, let's define our terms, okay? Gerrymandering refers to the drawing of congressional districts specifically. Remember, there's no such thing as a Senate district. A Senate district is a whole state. Every senator is elected from a whole state. You're the senator from Montana, you're the senator from Connecticut, you're a senator from a whole state. But states are divided up into congressional districts, and you can draw the congressional districts so that they encompass the voters you want and leave out the voters you don't want. And the goal of drawing congressional districts is always to spread your own voters out enough that they're a bare majority in a lot of districts and concentrate the other guy's voters so they're like 90% in one district. So that then you can get 10 districts with 53% and your opponent gets one district with 90%. Do you all understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that's called a gerrymander. Yeah. Once upon a time, gerrymandering had to be done with rulers and maps and drawing lines and doing the best job you can to gerrymander. There are now computer programs that let you gerrymander. You feed in the voter registration data of every voter in your state, and it draws congressional districts for you that do what you want them to do. And that has become a topic of a lot of conversation in recent elections, where Democrats have actually gotten more votes than Republicans in recent congressional elections in total number of votes for Congress, but the Republicans control Congress because of their control of the districting. However, here's the however, political scientists who have looked at this think that gerrymandering is not as big a factor as it is sometimes described as being, because anyway, Democrats gerrymander themselves by their sorting of where they live. So my congressional district in Manhattan and the Bronx was not drawn to concentrate Democratic voters. It's just jam-packed with Democratic voters. You didn't have to try to concentrate Democratic voters and free up the upstate districts to be more Republican. That's how Democrats and Republicans in New York State live. And so it's not that gerrymandering is not a factor at all. In some states like Pennsylvania, we've really seen that play out. But overall in the United States, again, you can just see as you look at this map that Democrats are voluntarily concentrating themselves in a few areas, and again, as long as we have a Senate that's state by state, and all these states have 2 senators the same way California does, and as long as we have Democrats even within a state concentrating in the cities and leaving many congressional districts in the state wide open, that will continue to be a big factor. It doesn't mean gerrymandering is a non-factor, but Democrats' ideological sorting of where they live, again, not based on ideology, but resulting in an ideological sort, has an enormous impact on that.
Just your comment on the self-sorting and and the cities. But if you were to draw a map that overlaid this with where the 1%ers are, isn't it somewhat counterintuitive to what they call the Republican Party, the party of the rich, to a certain extent, because it protects the interests of the rich? But the rich are also concentrated in the cities. I mean, particularly places like New York and the blue sections of California, and maybe even the blue sections of Texas, though maybe their, official addresses are in Florida. But like all of that, it's just an interesting.
So I had this exact conversation with my students today because they said, oh, all the elite rich people, are Democrats,
maybe it's
Hollywood
not the
and movie
Republican.
stars. And
Yeah.
so I showed my students data. It's very important when we talk about elections. I think I said this last time, but I'll say it again because it's super important when we talk about elections. We all have gut senses and instincts. Our instincts are shaped by what we know and what we see and whom we interact with. And it's really important to look at data because the American electorate is really big and really varied, and our own guts are really poor indicators of what's going on out there. And I told them, as an example, Donald Trump sometimes points to the number of people coming to his rallies and their enthusiasm as proof that he's going to win this thing. Mitt Romney was having enormous rallies leading up to the 2012 election. 10,000, tens of thousands, enormous rallies. And in fact, Mitt Romney got a lot of votes. He got like 60 million votes, give or take. The only thing is, the size of the American electorate, 60 million votes is not big enough to win. So your sense of enthusiasm from how many people come to your rallies and how fired up, you could have 60 million Americans fired up to vote for you. That's a lot of Americans, and you'd lose. So it's important that we not go by our sense of this. It's also important that what we say, when we say, wealthier Americans are more likely to vote Republican, understand that doesn't mean 98% more likely. Okay? It doesn't mean that it's a 90-10 split. But if the wealthiest Americans are a 60-some-odd% to 30-some-odd% split, and the poorest Americans go 70-30 the other way, that's a meaningful difference, even if you can know a lot of really rich, Hollywood stars or new media moguls or whatever who are the 30-some-odd% of billionaires who vote Democratic. That make sense to you?
Totally. I just think it's so interesting that in the end, people always associate the Republican Party with the party of the wealthy, but mostly
That's
either
old.
they're
That's
not
old.
voting for the Republican Party or
That's
their
very
votes are
old.
marginalized.
It's very
So it's
old.
not so
Yeah.
old. So let me just tell you
I
that
don't think
I
it
went
is.
through the numbers with my students today. The 2012, 2008, we went all the way back to 2000. Again, because I say to them, we can't be doing this from our belly buttons. It's got to be from data. Okay? And in fact, the wealthiest Americans have voted more for Republicans than for Democrats in every election except 2008, where it was evenly split 49%, 49%. However, here's a few things to say. That data that we were looking at chops off the wealthiest Americans at $100,000 or more income a year. And I said to my students, you really would need more granular and broken out data than this. What if I say 500,000? What if I say 1 million? What if I say 10 million? Let's look at those numbers because that would be very important. The other thing is that this year we are seeing something different that we have not seen before, and that is college-educated whites who tended to be Republican voters. Again, do you know college-educated whites who voted Democratic? Of course you do. But looking at the data, that college-educated whites voted more Republican than Democratic, that is being contested this year because of the particular kinds of appeals that Donald Trump is presenting and to whom they are appealing. So this year you may see things being different, but it's very important not to think that because we know of, some movie stars or some tech figures or some billionaires we know in New York who are voting Democratic, that therefore means the majority of the best off Americans vote Democratic. That has not historically been the case. Well, again, what we'll see this election cycle, I can't tell you, but that has not historically been the case. Okay, a couple more things, and then we are going to move on. Obviously, the border areas with large Hispanic population becoming increasingly Democratic is a story that was going on within the Republican Party. President George W. Bush was very successful as a Republican at appealing to Hispanic voters. Since then, for a variety of reasons, the Republican Party has had a harder time making its case to Hispanic voters. And so that bluification of the border regions has been going on for a while. We obviously don't know yet, but it seems likely that Hispanic voters in this particular election given the tone and tenor of the conversation, will be more likely even than they had been in the past to vote Democratic, which is why, and this is the last thing I want to say, it's not really the last thing I want to say, but I want to stop now. Last thing I will say for now is, our usual landscape of swing states is being shaken up in this election. It is being shaken up for reasons both long-term and particular to 2016, and it's worth paying attention to both of them. Not that long ago, neither Virginia nor North Carolina was remotely at all in play in a presidential election. They were both going to go Republican, okay? Virginia at this point is considered to be pretty safely Democratic. Donald Trump at some point took down his ads in Virginia. He stopped advertising on TV there because the polling was showing that it was pretty safely Democratic. And North Carolina is this very hotly contested swing state that went for Obama in 08, didn't in 12, and it's a very hotly contested state right now, okay? There are a couple of reasons for that. Again, there's the long-term reasons and the short-term reasons. There is a long-term move of voters in the United States, I'm sure you know this, from what they call the Rust Belt areas to the Sun Belt areas, right? From the old, cold factory states of the Northeast and the Midwest where they get a lot of snow and the manufacturing jobs are decreasing up there and people are moving away from there, and down to the Sun Belt, warmer areas, more banking, more finance, more other kinds of jobs, and people are moving down there, okay? Those college-educated people moving into the cities in the South, coming for jobs that require a college degree, are bringing more blue voting patterns to those states. You're seeing it in Atlanta around Georgia. You're seeing it in North Carolina in the areas around Duke University and UNC, where there are a lot of different kinds of jobs connected to those universities and growing out of them. There are also a lot of banking jobs in North Carolina. You're seeing it happening in Arizona. That is a long-term pattern in American life of people moving into those states from the outside and being college-educated workers moving in and gradually shifting voting patterns in states that might have been very Republican for a long time. So the fact that Georgia is polling pretty close right now, again, I don't think anyone expects Georgia to be anything other than Republican in this election, but it's polling pretty close. Arizona is polling even closer. The Democrats are actually trying to make a play for Arizona. So that's partially a function of this. The other thing that's happening, and this we talked about last time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, was 2016 specific, and that is the realigning of who is voting for whom. The shaking up of who votes for whom, and that is more specific to this election. So a good example of this is Ohio. Ohio has a lot of working class white voters. Ohio was the canonical swing state that you fought for, right? The line was, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. Whoever wins Ohio, that's going to win the presidential election, okay? Donald Trump is polling clearly ahead in Ohio. And Hillary Clinton has many paths to winning this election without Ohio, which would be interesting. It'll be a break in a very long history of as Ohio goes, so goes the nation. Okay, and that's because working class white populations are very much turning into Trump voters, even if they might have voted Democratic in the past, and shaking things up. Another state where we're seeing that is Iowa, which was seen as a swing state, actually often went blue. And Iowa seems to be polling red, Republican this cycle. And again, Iowa is an extremely white state. It is a very, very white state, and that explains what we're seeing. And on the other hand, as I said, states that seem to be totally safe the other way, now that we're putting new population groups in play, so the best example of this, like mind-blowing example of this, is Texas. Trump's lead in Texas right now is in single digits and not particularly high ones. That is shocking for somebody who grew up with Texas as the most reliable Republican state in the country. But the combination of, again, the influx of those out-of-state voters moving to the cities, whatever they're moving to the cities for, as well as the mobilization of the Hispanic vote, given the terms of the debate in this particular election. It's not that I think that Donald Trump is not going to carry Texas, but I think Hillary Clinton's going to carry Texas. I think Trump's going to carry Texas. But the fact that it's even up for conversation, that it's even in the mix, is a striking shift, and it's a striking shift in part because of longer-term historical trends going on here, and it's in the mix also partially because of very specific developments to this election. So when they talk about swing states in this election, and they say, North Carolina and Nevada, and they're not talking about Ohio, because it's not even so much swing anymore, we can put it in Trump's column, that is a reflection of, again, both long-term demographic shifts and the sort of immediate where we find ourselves in this election, and that's very interesting in terms of shifting long-established voting patterns in states. Let's take a couple of questions, then we're going to move on to the second thing I want to talk about.
I just want to ask about polls. There are a lot of numbers out there. And after a while, they become very overwhelming in the sense that you almost feel like you can pick a poll that says what you want it to say, sort of like digging down in statistics. How do we evaluate which polls to pay attention to?
Okay, so here's the thing about polling. There are two separate things about polling. One is good poll, bad poll. Is the poll statistically well constructed? We'll talk about that for a minute. And the other is, even with good polls, if I toss a coin, what are my odds of getting heads? 50%. If I toss a coin 10 times, am I guaranteed of getting 5 heads and 5 tails?
Nope.
No, I am not. In fact, I very likely may not get 5 heads and 5 tails. If I toss a coin, you can keep going. If I toss a coin 300 million times, I'll probably be closer to exactly happening. You need to understand about polling that we would expect in polling a population that if one candidate really had a 4-point lead, you'd have some polls that showed a 6-point lead, and some polls that showed a 2-point lead, and some polls that showed a 4-point lead. It's not taking a temperature. You are going to see, by the nature of statistics and sampling, you are going to see variation. What we see now is a whole heck of a lot of what psychologists call motivated reasoning, which basically means I reason based on what I want to believe. So you find the poll that says what you want to think, and you say, ha-ha, here you see proof. Where that's not a very good way to go about understanding things. There is a wide range of polls, and there is a wide fluctuation in polls. Different polls make different assumptions. This gets to good polling, bad polling now. So that's about, even with good polling, you would see this. And yes, it would converge on a line. There would be a line, a 4-point lead. But in order to converge on a line of 4-point lead, you'd see above and below and here and there. You would not see 4 points, 4 points, 4 points, 4 points. It was a 4-point lead. That's not how polling works. It's not how polling works. And when people act like every variation in the poll reflects a change in the underlying race, it might, but it also might reflect the inherent variability of polling. That's when you get people hysterical, because I'm refreshing the polling sites every 5 minutes on my phone, up to, down to, up to, down to. That does not necessarily mean a blessed thing, so stop hitting refresh on your phone and go do something else. Okay, but now, to speak to good polling, bad polling. Every poll has to decide what it thinks the voting population is going to look like. So how do you decide that? Well, okay, there is X% registered Democrats, X% registered Republicans, X% registered Independents. I'll make up a sample population based on that. Well, but do you think Democrats and Republicans are going to turn out in exactly the same numbers? How do I model turnout? Well, maybe let's look at what they did in the past. Well, are there things this year that might make it different than it was in the past? Do I think you begin to understand the many, 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 many questions that we could ask about this? Good, now, you have bad pollsters. I'm leaving them aside. You have bad pollsters doing bad polls, forget them. Good pollsters trying to do good statistics are going to make different calls in those questions. And they're going to get different polling results in part because their inputs are different. I think Democrats are going to be more motivated in this election. I think Republicans are going to be more motivated in this election. I think there will be more ticket splitters who vote for one party at the top and other parties. I don't think all of these things come into the mix in terms of talking about polling. And then you start to add in things like, I'll tell you 2 things you add in, and then we'll stop. There are many things that go into this. There are reams and reams of interesting stuff being written about polling and how we construct polls, but I'm just going to tell you 2 things you add in. One is, in order to do a really high quality poll, you call people on the phone. What if people don't answer their phone? What if they refuse to talk to you? The response rate for polls has been going down and down and down. You do that too, because I do that. When a pollster calls me and it's dinner time, and they're like, can I just ask you 35 questions about your opinions about this race? I'm like, really not? I'm stirring the pot of macaroni and cheese, have a good night. So I'm yet another non-response. And then you have the whole question about people who are cell phone only, right? If the polls are doing, for a long time, polls polled only landlines. Now you have some polls that are landline only polls. Landline, plus I'm like an old lady. I am exactly the age of people who still have landlines. You're 2 years younger than me, you don't have a landline and you're done. As seriously, I'm like the cutoff point for people who still have landlines. Because I saw the polls, I saw a poll of how many Americans only have, or data on how many Americans only have landlines, and I was shocked. Only have cell phones, and I was shocked. I was like, I'm the old lady here. I have cell phone. I have a landline. So that's another issue, not responding to polls. And another issue that is fascinating, which people are starting to talk about now, and this is really not what I want to talk about now, and then I'll take your question and move on to what I want to talk about, is what have become very popular now, and I'm sure many of you have seen them, are these websites that aggregate polls. They don't follow one poll. I follow the NBC poll. I follow the CBS poll. I follow the U.gov poll. They don't follow one poll all the way through. They collect a lot of polls, mix them up in the blender, and say, overall, here's what emerges, okay? 538 is one such website, Real Clear Politics is one such website, Talking Points Memo is one such website, and people then are following, 538 will say this candidate is 65% likely to win and 35% likely to win based on the polls that they're feeding into the blender, okay? Here's the thing about good polling. It costs a lot of money. You have to hire statisticians to design your poll. You have to hire a lot of little people to sit there dialing numbers and trying to get me to not hang up on them while I'm stirring macaroni and cheese. When my poll was my thing that I ran with and everybody came to my site or read my newspaper to see my poll, then at least I made some money off my poll, so it was worth doing. If the poll that I spend so much money doing just becomes another data point thrown into 538's blender, and everyone's not coming to my website to see my poll, they're going to 538 or to Talking Points Memo or to Real Clear Politics to read their aggregation, I'm not making any money off my poll. And it's costing me a lot of money. And so the number of polls, I know it seems to you like there are a lot of polls, the number of good polls, like phone call calling polls in this election is way down because it doesn't pay for itself. So sometimes what fills the vacuum are these, gobbledygook online polls. Click if you like this candidate. You could set your cat up to sit there and, click all day long and it doesn't mean anything. Or people sort of overinterpret the polling data that we have. But in fact, we don't have more polls than we've had in the past. We have less good polling data than we've had in the past because the aggregators that were such a revelation when 538, the person behind 538, Nate Silver, really started doing his thing in politics. Before that, he worked in sports statistics. He started doing his thing in politics in 2008, and it was a revelation how much you could get at by just looking at all the polls together. But now that that's become the operating model, it's actually made it really economically inefficient for news organizations to do polls at a time when news organizations are in a bad way anyway. Last question, and then I want to talk about the other thing I want to talk about.
Do big college towns have a blue
Yes.
influence, or are they irrelevant because the kids registered to vote where they came
No,
from?
kids can register to vote where in college, and they absolutely can have a blue influence. In Wisconsin, which has had which had a law passed that in certain ways restricted access to voting or made it harder to vote. One of the things they tried to do is make it harder for college kids to vote because they vote blue. So that absolutely is a noted effect.
College IDs aren't a valid.
Right, say you can't use college IDs. Okay, I want to go on to the next thing that I wanted to talk about. I'll be happy to take some more questions afterwards. And I'll tell you why I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about this or not, and I'll tell you why I think that I have to. Okay? I primarily come at this election as a history teacher. And there are things in this election cycle that as a history teacher have been deeply, deeply distressing to me, far beyond the specific, the day-to-day back and forth of whose team is up and whose team is down. And there are things that I think are going to have long-lasting effects on our body politic and the political discourse in this country, regardless of whose team is up and whose team is down. And I think they're really, really important. So, great. See these things, you notice them as a history teacher, you think they're really important, why on earth would you not talk about them? The reason not to talk about them is because the issues that I'm about to talk about are inherently asymmetrical. The two candidates are not generating this problem in equal measure and an equal amount. So if I start to talk about it, it then becomes I'm political, I'm taking sides, I'm inserting myself into what I'm teaching my students in a very particular way. But here's the problem. If I'm not prepared to talk about it, that also becomes then a lack of sort of discharging my responsibility to teach my students or to teach you what I actually think to be true and really important, because I'm afraid of what people are going to say and how people are going to react. So I went back and forth about doing this, but as the weeks go on, it seems ever more important, so I'm going to do it. With the understanding that I spent a lot of time last week, I think, trying to give us an empathetic read on the person who votes for Donald Trump. I would like us to really try to understand who that voter is and what motivates them. So when I talk now in a way that sounds like I'm taking sides in this a little bit, let's try to understand it in that context. And here's what I want to talk about. We have long viewed our democracy as incredibly strong and robust. And the reason why we view it as very strong and robust is because it looks very strong and robust. Here we are 240 years out and like, we're good. And we've gone through a lot of stuff and there's been all kinds of problems and issues, and you know what? At the end of the day, here we are, the oldest functioning democracy, constitutional democracy, and we are good. And one of the things that political scientists have said, but that this election has really driven home for me in a very immediate way, is that what makes our democracy function and function well is not just the rules written down in the Constitution about how you choose a president or how you choose a senator or how we conduct elections. But they are the infrastructure that supports that, which are the norms that govern our expectations of how people, how candidates, how voters, how political actors carry themselves in this democracy. And if that's not clear, and I'm not making myself clear, I want to make an analogy to what we talk about in the world of halacha, where we distinguish between halacha, Jewish law, and minhag, which is custom or practice. And sometimes my students will say, well, if it's just custom or practice, why do we have to do it? Why can't we get rid of it? And the answer actually is, we have a very long tradition of taking minhag really, really seriously and not violating minhag lightly. And statements like, minhag avotenu biyadenu, the minhag of our parents is in our hands, right? And that the minhag of our parents is like a law. The custom of our parents is like a law. What does that mean? It means if we've been doing this for a while, it's really important that we keep on doing it and not think lightly about getting rid of it. That's how we Ashkenazim find ourselves still not eating kitniot on Pesach, even though I'm really convinced that no stray grains of wheat have made it into my corn. And it's those norms which are so essential, but actually it turns out kind of fragile, that are being threatened in this election. And once you knock them down, I don't know that they come back so easily. And I think that hurts, really, I do not say this in any kind of hyperbolic or exaggerated way. I think that hurts our democracy. And among all of these norms, the most important one, the one that I'm going to start with, so if we run out of time, at least we get through this one. So I'm an American history teacher. I teach my kids American history, and I teach them that the election of 1800, the presidential election of 1800, is called the Revolution of 1800. I don't teach this. Every American history teacher teaches American history teaches. It's not my great discovery. That's what we teach in American history, the Revolution of 1800. Why is the election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800? It's the Revolution of 1800 because it's the first time that a president of the United States gets voted out of office. The people say, we don't want you anymore. And the president, that was John Adams, he was a one-term president, and the American people said, actually, we'd rather have Thomas Jefferson as our president. We don't want you anymore. And John Adams, instead of saying, guess what, guys? I'm the commander-in-chief. I have the army. So I don't much care what you want. John Adams packs his bags and goes. And that's the Revolution of 1800, because that establishes for the first time the principle of the peaceful transfer of power. People who study emerging democracies talk all the time about the problem, about the risk. So we define a democracy as one person, one vote, right? One person, one vote, that's democracy. They talk about the risk of setting up a system that becomes one person, one vote, one time. And what that means is you vote somebody into office in a perfectly free and fair democratic election, and then they refuse to leave. We have seen this happen all over the place, right? You have leaders, whether it's Vladimir Putin in Russia, whether it was Hosni Mubarak when he was in Egypt, various leaders around the world who at some point acceded to their position democratically and then changed the rules and just refused to ever go. They said, I'm not going. In America, if you listen to losers' speeches on election night, they always say the same thing. The losers always say, the people have spoken. That's what the losers always say. The people have spoken. I wanted this. I worked for this. I spent God knows how many years of my life and God knows how much money hoping for this. But the people have spoken. And when the people have spoken, I pack my bags and go home. I have to say it's only in retrospect that I realize what an act of service to his country Al Gore did in 2000. And I'm not sure I recognized it at the time. I'm not discussing anything about the contested election of 2000. What you think of Al Gore, what you think of George W. Bush, what you think of the recount, what you think of the Supreme Court, none of it matters. When the Supreme Court handed down its decision, and Al Gore had to decide whether he was somehow going to try to fight something in some way, or he was going to say, I accept an adverse ruling of the Supreme Court, I'm packing my bags and going home. Al Gore said, I accept the adverse ruling of the Supreme Court, I'm packing my bags and going home. Go back and re-watch his concession speech that he gave in December. The election wasn't resolved until December. That he gave in December of 2000. I just did recently. I don't think I realized then what an act of service to his country that was. He could have said, the Supreme Court voted on a party line vote. It's not legitimate. The governor of Florida is the brother of the candidate for private, blah, blah, blah. He didn't say any of that. He said nothing in our country is going to be well served by carrying on this fight. We have to have at some point the peaceful transfer of power. The Supreme Court. That's not a rule written down anywhere. That is a norm of our democracy that we expect the loser to say, the people have spoken, I'm packing my bags and going home. To even introduce the idea into the body politic that I may or may not accept the outcome of the election, I will keep the American people in suspense, is a profoundly damaging thing to do, even if it doesn't come down to actually doing that. Because you have now raised the possibility that that's a thing that can be done. And that goes after a norm that is an essential norm in our democracy. I'm going to tell you about another one. Politicians hate the press. Hate the press. Hate the press. The reason why Hillary Clinton set up the private server that has given her headaches for however long is because she was trying to keep her emails away from the prying eyes of everybody. That worked out really well for her. Yeah. Politicians hate the press. That's all good. But politicians pay lip service to the idea, even they go home, we all know what they say at home about the press. They talk in public about the First Amendment as the crowning jewel of our system and the importance of a free press and holding the powerful accountable. What do they say at home about the press? Probably not repeatable, but that's what they have to say in public. Why? Because it is a norm of our democracy that we respect the free press as an essential part of keeping the powerful people honest, of getting at the truth of everything else. The norm of a free press actually in the United States was established before there was a United States. There was a very, very famous trial of a printer named John Peter Zenger. This is when the United States was still the British colonies. And Zenger had printed some unflattering things about some powerful people who didn't like unflattering things printed about them. And what the Zenger trial established, again, still as British colonies, was that truth is a defense against a charge of libel. If what you're saying is true, even if it's really unflattering and nasty and obnoxious, it's not libelous if it's true. I would not argue that most of our presidents or our senior politicians have been deeply fond of the press. But when we have a presidential candidate talking specifically about opening up libel laws to be able to go after news organizations that are printing unflattering stories, that is to introduce something into our national political discourse that hasn't been there out loud and in public, and it's important that it hasn't been there. It's important that there is a norm of talking as though we accept the value of the free press, even if I know what you're saying about the press and the privacy of your own home, or I could guess anyway, I don't know. And there are many such norms that in this election have been not followed, not obeyed. And in not following such a norm, you show how easy it is not to follow it. Turns out you could do these things. Turns out you can. And therefore, it's very hard to then go back and say, no, we have this norm that everybody has to say, no matter who's elected. If I lose, of course, I will 100% put my support behind the person who wins. We will unite behind our president. That's what we do as Americans. Once we don't have to say that, we don't have to say that. And if we don't have to say that, maybe at some point it's conceivable we don't have to do that. If you think I'm being alarmist and hysterical and crazy, I guess you think I'm being alarmist and hysterical and crazy, I actually think it's pretty alarming. And again, I can't tell you how many years I've stood in front of a class and talked to my students about the revolution of 1800 and said this, and talked about one man, one vote, one time, and talked about emerging democracies that don't emerge because one person gets into office and never goes. And what that means and says and does about our democracy, that now we're even introducing that as a factor into the conversation. I think we have sometimes gotten lost or gotten caught up in the more lurid details of what we're hearing. Today's breaking news headline, today's can you top this story or moment. And for me, when I step a little bit back from this election and get away from that today's can you top this story or moment, what this election to me is a story about is a story about things that we thought were essential norms of our democracy. And we would always say, well, if you violated that norm, your political career would be over, right? That's what we would have said about those norms. And yet, those norms are being violated, and no one's political career is being ended. And what that does is it makes it possible. It introduces it into the realm of possibility to keep violating those norms. And I don't know how easily you reconstruct that essential but fragile system of political norms that it turns out undergird and support our whole democracy once they've been undermined. We have all the rules on paper in the book, but there's something about how we do this that it turns out is really essential, and that I think has been undermined. I could go on about norms at great length. There are plenty of other such examples, but even at the risk of being seen as being asymmetrical or unbalanced in this, I think that as a historian, it's really important, as a teacher of history, I think it's really important that we pay attention to that. It's easy to get caught up in the day's news cycle, and who said what, and who's quoting whom, and what new poll came out, and who's up 1.5 points, and to step back and say, where are we as a democracy, and where do we, as a republic, and where do we hope to be as a republic, and that, I fear I am ending on a rather pessimistic note today. Maybe I should have done this first in the map afterwards. I'm cutting various other things that I wanted to say on the subject of norms. I think the Supreme Court is an important one. There are other things that are important, but since we are almost out of time, I'll stop for a few questions. But that, to me, if I think about something else that emerges to me as a global issue from this election, that is one. Next time, we will meet for after-action report analysis. Where are we? What does this look like? And what do we think? I'm assuming that by next Thursday we'll know who the next president of the United States is. But I shouldn't take anything for granted.
It used to be the norm.
I don't want to make it sound like I disagree with anything you just said about the difficulty.
You're allowed to disagree with anything I just said.
No, because I totally agree, but at the same time, isn't a major violation of norm the fact that a woman is running and has serious contention to be the president? Because many generations, the norm was white Protestant male privilege. So while
Protestant for a long time.
Well, it was. I mean, it was a major deal that Kennedy was elected as a Catholic. That was huge.
We remember.
I only read about it, but I can only say that, like, I feel a little trepidation in your framing of the analysis. While I wholly agree with your contentions, and we could even take this into the realm of your discussion of halakha, but saying that we can't violate norms because the norms themselves are inherently good.
But you were talking about behaviors, and now you're talking about something that's not a behavior.
Okay.
No, it's norms. The notion of the norm saying that you will cede a loss and acknowledge it and move on is a norm. It's a behavior. But so, I mean, so is inherently voting for a white male Protestant. That's also a behavior, or just access to certain things.
Right, so I think there
There are
is,
many norms, let's say, that maybe should be shot down, is the question.
let's leave aside for a second the question of halakha and
Yeah,
minhag, and whether you think we should, you can't, you know, pace. That's a different question.
Yeah.
But the question of what norms are norms, here I mean the unwritten rules of how we conduct ourselves within a political system that are not written down anywhere explicitly, but that turn out to be very important. And there's a lot to talk about the potential for a first woman president and how that has shaken up the system. But the norm that women are excluded from political participation really was essentially, fundamentally challenged 100 years ago when women were given the right to vote. It's been a slow grind from there to now, and there's certainly been a lot of backlash, but we're not now making the argument that women fundamentally should be allowed to engage in the political system. And I'm not saying that every norm of our politics, you're absolutely right, I'm not saying that every norm of our politics is a positive one and should be encouraged. So for example, you'll notice what I did not say. I did not say that fomenting racial resentment is a violation of our norms. Actually, fomenting racial resentment has been a norm of our politics for a very long time. It is not a violation of our norms at all, whether we like it or we don't like it or think it's terrible or it's horrible. Fomenting racial resentment is not a violation of American political norms. But there are certain things that even when other things were not, that we all took for granted, and those things, you are right, with more time and more nuance, we could kind of elaborate what we're talking about. I think listening to an adverse ruling with the Supreme Court is a very important whole thing to talk about. There's a lot more to discuss here. We're just running out of time, so we're not going to be able to do it yet. Yeah.
Isn't this everything that you just said about norms a direct result of the fact that he is not a politician? And that's exactly, I think, what he's been using as part of his appeal to many people, that he doesn't play.
Okay. You're getting into a very complicated question. I want to tell you what it is. I'm not going to pretend to try to answer it. Okay? You ready? Here's the complicated question. The complicated question is Donald Trump totally different than any other Republican, or is he exactly like every other Republican? I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but let me tell you what I mean. Okay? The Democrats made a choice. I'm just going to start talking really fast. That's my solution. The Democrats made a choice at the convention in the summer to try to cast Donald Trump as not like any other Republicans, to say to Republicans, feel free to come on over and vote for us this time because he's not like any other Republican. And those would be all the things emphasizing what you brought up. Outside of politics, doesn't follow the norms, et cetera, et cetera. There has been another school of thought that says that in certain ways, the Republican Party overall has been shifting some of these political norms. I'm not entering into this debate now as to whether yes or no. I'm just telling you that's the other school of thought. An example of this that I would put out there right now is that a number of Republican senators have come forward and said that if Hillary Clinton is elected, they will not confirm anyone she nominates to the Supreme Court. They will hold for at least 4 years any Supreme Court vacancy that exists or emerges. That would be challenging a norm that a Senate, even a Senate from an opposing party, confirms a president's nominees to the court if they're vaguely reasonable people. So do you say Donald Trump is of his own kind, he's different than anybody else, and therefore he is doing things differently because he's totally different? Or do you say there's a trend emerging within the Republican Party here that he is actually reflecting? Different political scientists say different things about this, and the electoral strategy can go either way. Do you try to tie all Republicans to Donald Trump, or you do, as in fact the Clinton convention tried to do, and peel them away to say to Republicans, feel free to come over on the other side? I'm not positing that, Shayla, I'm just telling you it's out there. Yes, you had a question.
Just to underline what you said about the 2000 election, was the fact that the Gore ticket seemed to have a clear majority of the popular vote.
Well, they did have a clear majority of popular vote. The only problem is that in our Constitution that doesn't matter. The popular vote counts for nothing. It's so hard for my students to wrap their heads around this. Like, how do you become president? You get more votes? Nope, doesn't matter at all. There's nothing in the Constitution about who gets more votes. It's only about the electoral votes. So any debate over the legitimacy or lack thereof of the 2000 election outcome can't hinge on the fact that Gore clearly, he got a majority of the popular vote, because that does not matter in our constitutional system. It's irrelevant. Yes.
So much for me.
In terms of the
So much
election,
for me.
but in terms of what I've seen since Clinton, when the Republicans at least say, we will not pass anything that you propose.
Is this historically something that?
Right, so that, I mean, there are many examples of this,
Is this
Earlier
new or is it
history,
cyclical?
Is this something that's
it's,
new?
no, this is pretty new.
Okay.
And this intense polarization is pretty new. The routine use of the filibuster in the Senate, there is a maneuver by which a senator can force any bill that's proposed to have 60 votes to get passed instead of 51. That once upon a time was saved for outstanding circumstances. More recently under Obama, it's kind of become routine. Anything needs 60 votes to pass. That was why he had such a hard time getting Obamacare passed. He had to figure out where he was getting his votes from. Anything needs 60 votes to pass in the Senate. That was not the way politics was run. Do we see this increasing extreme partisan polarization as part of something that will eventually cycle, or where it leads, or where it takes us? Historians are very bad at predicting the future. I don't try, but it is not typical of.
But was it historically ever present before?
It historically didn't look like this. The parties were ideologically much more mixed. There were more liberal Republicans and more conservative Democrats. The parties are now much more ideologically sorted. And that has led to much sharper breaks and very kind of scorched earth politics, and not cooperation across the aisle about really almost anything. And again, what caused that and what contributed to that is another I feel like we should do a longer trends in American politics, not just the government at some point, because there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. But that is a relatively recent phenomenon, the intensity of the partisanship and the lack of any coming together, working together. Last question, and then we'll break, and anyone who still wants to talk to me, I'm free, so you can just come over.
Has the role of the press changed over history, or was it always so polarized? And if there's been a change, does that mitigate at all the issue that you raised in terms of how the press is respected or not these days?
Okay, so here's an interesting thing about the press. In the 19th century, basically all press outlets were explicitly political, kind of the way they are in Britain. Every newspaper sort of stands for a political party. And they were explicitly advocating for their political party and their team. In the United States, at some point, we developed a norm about the press, that the press were supposed to be dispassionate and objective observers, right? Kind of not in it on either side, but recounting what they saw. That's like the Walter Cronkite model of the press. You didn't have a sense that they played for either team. You hear older reporters saying, I don't vote, because I wouldn't want to sort of line myself up with any team. That model we have seen more recently breaking down into more explicitly partisanly aligned news outlets. That's actually not new. That's a return to a much older model. What I think is new and different and really problematic, and we I think got to this at the end last time, is the fact that there is a lot of, I'm not talking now about really skewed interpretation or really slanted towards your side. I'm talking about fake stuff out there. Facebook is full of fake news. Twitter is full of fake news that's being picked up and circulated by people as though it's real news. And there's this kind of fact-free jumble in which I just don't know if stuff is true or totally not true, that shapes people's perceptions and understanding in a very problematic way that once wouldn't have been possible because there were more gatekeepers, and now nobody has gatekeepers. I'm going to give you a tiny example from last night, and then we'll end. At some point, it showed up on Twitter, a prominent pollster named Frank Luntz tweeted that there were a whole bunch of Chicago fans who couldn't get to the World Series game. They were stuck on the tarmac at O'Hare. They couldn't take off because President Obama was in Chicago campaigning, and they had shut down airspace over Chicago. And he tweeted this, that all these poor World Series fans, and it starts getting retweeted up, but put up everywhere. And then somebody who is way more of an aviation buff than I am had access to the actual maps, live maps of U.S. airspace. Why somebody's looking at this, I don't know, but he's looking at live maps of U.S. airspace. Obama's in Florida, the closed-off security zone around Obama's in Florida, and he shows on his lovely map that over Chicago there are big thunderstorms, and that's why the airspace over Chicago was shut down. I guarantee you there are people today who think that mean old nasty old President Obama caused some Chicago Cubs fans to miss their flight to Cleveland for the last game of the World Series because he was there. And this guy who's a very respected pollster, he's not a Yahoo. His answer was like, whoops, my bad. I retweeted something that I saw that seemed interesting without checking it. But that's how bad information, any study of news on Facebook tells us that an enormous percentage of news on Facebook. Again, do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying partisan interpretation skewed to prefer my candidate. I'm saying not true, fake, false. bogus. But
You telling the students this?
yeah, all the time. But unless I'm sitting with them as they scroll through Facebook, I can't point out this is bogus and that's bogus. And you know what? And it's a lot of work to ask us all to go triple check everything we find on Facebook. I have retweeted stuff that I then found out wasn't true. I unretweeted. But it's a lot of work, and sometimes my filter is better. I'm like, wait a second, that can't be serious. That's a joke, right? And oh yes, it is. And other people fall for it. But you see even really professional news people occasionally doing that because the pressure of speed and clicks and eyeballs and attention is there. And I saw something that looks really great, and all I have to do is hit like on Facebook and hit retweet and hit whatever it is I have to hit. But it's not true. And so it's not a partisan media is not actually a new thing, but a totally fact-free media environment is kind of a new thing, in really troubling and problematic ways. Okay, thank you so much. We'll see each other again next Thursday.